My brother stole my wife and son. Now he's broke, disowned, and begging me for help. Hello, read it. For most of my life, I thought I understood what betrayal felt like. I thought I knew the shape of it, the slow, creeping sickness of knowing someone was against you, the sharp sting of knives slipping between ribs when you least expected it. But nothing could have prepared me for the truth. Nothing could have prepared me for the moment I realized that the worst betrayal doesn't come from strangers. It comes from the people who were supposed to love you the most. My name is Adam, and I'm 38 years old. If you had asked me a few years ago, I would have told you I had built a good life. A strong career, a beautiful wife, and most importantly, a son I adored. For years, I woke up every morning believing I had done everything right, that the sacrifices I made had been worth it. I believed that despite all the setbacks, despite the chaos of my childhood, I had carved out something real, something unshakable. I was wrong. I should have seen the warning signs long before everything unraveled. But love has a way of blinding you, of making you see only what you want to see. And for most of my life, I had wanted to believe that I could escape the shadows of my past. Those shadows had a name. Ryan, my brother, my tormentor, my own personal curse. Ryan was the kind of person who took up space in a way that was impossible to ignore. Loud, charismatic, effortlessly likable to anyone who wasn't paying close enough attention. But I had been paying attention my whole life, because I had no choice. We were only 2 years apart, but it felt like we had grown up in different worlds. Where I was quiet, he was the center of attention. Where I followed the rules, he broke them and somehow still got rewarded. It started when we were kids, the little things. He would steal my things and laugh when I cried, knowing our parents would brush it off. He would break something of mine and find a way to blame me for it. And no matter what he did, there was always an excuse. Boys will be boys. Ryan is just a free spirit. You need to be the bigger person, Adam. I tried. God, I tried. But the older we got, the worse it became. Ryan had a way of making my life hell in ways that seemed almost calculated. He always knew exactly how to push my buttons, exactly how to humiliate me without getting his own hands dirty. He would steal my friends, charm his way into my social circles, always making sure I was in his shadow. If I liked a girl, he would flirt with her just to prove he could. He never cared about them. It was never about love. It was about winning. It was about proving time and time again that no matter what I did, I would never come first. And my parents? They let it happen. They worshipped Ryan, blinded by his charm, convinced that he was special. I was the afterthought, the dependable one, the one they didn't have to worry about. So they didn't. I thought moving away would fix things. I thought building my own life would finally free me from him. And for a while it did. I met Lauren in my late 20s. She was everything I had ever wanted. Kind, intelligent, beautiful in a way that felt effortless. For the first time, I felt like I had something that was just mine. I fell hard. And when we got married, I thought I had finally left Ryan behind. We had our son, Caleb, 2 years into our marriage. And from the moment I held him, I knew I would do anything for him. He was my world, my greatest pride. But Ryan had a way of creeping back in. It started small. He showed up unannounced, always acting like he was just passing through, just checking in. He and Lauren got along well, too well in hindsight. He had that effortless charm, and Lauren, like everyone else, fell for it. I told myself it was nothing, that he was just trying to reconnect, that I was imagining the way he looked at her sometimes, the way she laughed just a little too much at his jokes. And then everything fell apart. I don't remember the exact moment I first started to suspect. Maybe it was the way Lauren started pulling away from me, the way her excuses started piling up. Maybe it was the way Ryan started avoiding me, his usual arrogance replaced with something almost guilty. But the truth didn't come all at once. It came in pieces. A late-night phone call I wasn't supposed to overhear. A hushed conversation that stopped the moment I entered the room. The slip of a friend's tongue, a comment that made no sense, until it did. And then the moment that shattered everything. A paternity test. I don't even know what made me do it. Maybe it was paranoia. Maybe it was some deep, gut-wrenching instinct I had ignored for too long. But when I got the results back, my hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the envelope. Caleb wasn't mine. The son I had loved, raised, devoted my life to, he wasn't mine. Ryan had taken that from me too. I confronted Lauren, and there was no denying it. No carefully crafted lie to soften the blow. She crumbled under the truth, sobbing, begging, trying to explain. But there was nothing to explain. Ryan had been there in the moments when I wasn't. Ryan had whispered his way into her life the same way he had stolen everything else from me. And now, the son I had loved more than anything belonged to him. The fallout was worse than anything I could have imagined. Lauren left. Caleb. No, not Caleb. Not my son. Not anymore was taken from me. My entire world collapsed in on itself. I lost everything. And Ryan? He didn't even have the decency to apologize. He didn't even look ashamed. He had won. Or so he thought. Because fate has a way of evening the scales. Years passed. My parents, for all their favoritism, had limits. When they found out what Ryan had done, something shifted. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was finally seeing him for who he really was. Maybe it was the fact that, for the first time, Ryan's actions had consequences that couldn't be ignored. They cut him off, distanced themselves from him. And when they died, the final blow was delivered. They left me everything. A $2 million inheritance. A final, unspoken apology for a lifetime of neglect. And Ryan? He got nothing. And now, after years of silence, after taking everything from me, after leaving me broken, he's back. Crawling. Begging. And for the first time in my life, I hold all the power. And I have no intention of forgiving him. The first time I saw Ryan after years of silence, I almost didn't recognize him. He had always been larger than life, the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded attention without trying. But the man standing at my doorstep now wasn't that man. He looked smaller somehow, shrunken. His hair was unkempt, his face hollowed out by time, and, if I had to guess, desperation. His clothes, once tailored and sharp, were wrinkled and slightly oversized. As if he had lost weight he couldn't afford to lose. I should have slammed the door in his face. But I didn't. Not because I forgave him. Not because I had even the slightest ounce of sympathy left for him. But because I wanted to see it. I wanted to see him like this, broken, stripped of his arrogance, brought low by the very life he had built for himself. For a long moment, we just stared at each other. Then, Ryan swallowed hard and spoke. I need your help. I almost laughed. The sheer audacity of it. After everything he had done, after the life he had burned to the ground, he had the nerve to show up here and ask me for help. But I didn't laugh. I just tilted my head slightly, watching him waiting. Ryan had always been a master manipulator. He knew exactly how to spin a story, how to frame things so that he came out looking like the victim. And I had no doubt he had rehearsed this moment in his head, planned every word. Still, I let him talk. And what he said caught me off guard. He had nothing. No job, no home, no money. He had burned through everything, used up every resource. And now, with nowhere else to turn, he had come to me. Not because he wanted to, but because he had to. And Lauren? She was gone. The same woman who had torn my life apart had done the same to him. After a few years, she had moved on to someone wealthier, more stable. Someone who wasn't Ryan. She had taken Caleb with her, disappearing into a new life without a second thought. Poetic justice. For the first time, Ryan knew what it felt like to be discarded. To have everything you thought was yours ripped away without warning. To be left with nothing but regret and bitterness. I should have felt satisfaction, maybe even happiness. But all I felt was nothing. He had already taken everything from me. There was nothing left for me to lose. Still, I let him talk. He spun a story about second chances, about making amends. He talked about how he had changed, how he regretted everything, how he wanted to fix things. But even now, even as I watched him crumble in front of me, I could see the truth beneath his words. He wasn't here because he was sorry. He was here because he was desperate. I had something he wanted, something he thought he could take from me again. $2 million. And that was when I knew Ryan didn't come back for me. He came back for the money. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, I felt something colder settle inside me. He had always been like this. Always taking, always consuming, always looking for the next thing to feed his selfishness. And now, when he had run out of options, he had come to the one person he had spent his entire life betraying. I leaned against the doorway, studying him, letting the silence stretch between us. I could see it now. He expected me to cave, to be the same Adam I had always been, the responsible one, the reliable one, the one who always cleaned up his messes. But that Adam didn't exist anymore. So I smiled, just a little, just enough to make his breath hitch. And then I said, "No." Ryan's face barely changed, but I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. He wasn't prepared for rejection. I stepped back, about to close the door, when he did something I never expected. He dropped to his knees. Ryan, the same man who had tormented me, stolen from me, destroyed me, was kneeling in front of me, begging. Panic turned to desperation, his voice cracking as he tried to spin another lie, another excuse, another reason why I should save him. He talked about our parents, about how they wouldn't have wanted this. He talked about how we were still brothers, no matter what had happened. And then, the final card. The only card he had left to play. "Caleb, I know I don't deserve it," he said, his voice shaking. "But, don't you miss him?" I froze. For years, I had forced myself to let go. Forced myself to accept that Caleb was not mine, that I had no claim to him. But the moment Ryan said his name, the pain came rushing back. And he knew it. Ryan had always known how to find the cracks in my armor, how to dig his fingers in and twist until I broke. But not this time. I met his gaze, my chest tight, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, without another word, I stepped back and shut the door. Ryan pounded on it, shouted my name, tried every manipulation he could think of, but I didn't open it again. I just stood there listening to the man who had stolen everything from me finally realize that he had lost. For good. I thought shutting the door on Ryan would be the end of it. I should have known better. For as long as I could remember, Ryan had a way of surviving, of clawing his way out of situations that would have destroyed anyone else. He was like a parasite, latching onto people who could offer him something, attention, money, security, until he drained them dry. I had seen it happen over and over again, first with our parents, then with me, and finally with Lauren. And now, with nothing left, with nowhere else to turn, I knew he wasn't just going to vanish. For days I waited. Silence stretched between us, but it was not the kind of silence that meant things were over. It was the kind that warned of something lurking, something waiting just beneath the surface. Every time my phone buzzed, my pulse jumped. I avoided social media, resisted the urge to check messages from relatives, knowing that sooner or later, Ryan would try again. He was not the type to accept a final no. He had never learned how. But when the message finally came, it wasn't from him. It was from Lauren. I hadn't heard from her in years. She had cut me off completely after the truth came out, disappearing into her new life with Caleb. I had told myself I was okay with it, that I had nothing left to say to her anyway. But now, staring at her name on my screen, I felt something close to nausea curl in my stomach. I didn't want to open it. I didn't want to know what she had to say. But I did. The message was short. She needed to talk. It was about Ryan. I didn't respond right away. My first instinct was to ignore it, to delete it and move on. Ryan wasn't my problem anymore. If Lauren had made the mistake of letting him back into her life, that was her burden to bear. She had chosen him over me, over everything I had built with her. She had believed his lies once, and if she had done it again, that wasn't my responsibility. But then I thought about Caleb, and that was what made me agree to meet her. The coffee shop was in a part of town I hadn't been to in years. It was neutral territory, a place with no memories attached to it. When I arrived, Lauren was already sitting at a table in the corner, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup, her shoulders slightly hunched. She looked older, not in the way that age naturally changes a person, but in the way that life does. There were lines on her face I didn't remember, a tightness around her mouth, a weariness in her eyes. For a long moment, I just stood there, looking at her. Then, finally, I sat down. There was no warmth between us. Whatever had once existed, love, resentment, anger, had burned away over the years, leaving behind something colder, something detached. But there was no hesitation in her voice when she spoke. She told me everything. Ryan had nothing. No job, no home, no future. The same patterns that had defined his life had caught up to him. And now, with no one left to use, he had done something desperate. He had found Caleb. He had told him the stories I had heard my whole life. The stories about brotherhood, about loyalty, about second chances. He had convinced Caleb that family meant something, that no matter what had happened in the past, blood was still blood. And Caleb had believed him. He had let Ryan in, and now Ryan had done what he always did. He had taken. Lauren's hands trembled slightly as she explained how Ryan had manipulated Caleb into signing paperwork for a loan. It had been gradual, a slow process of trust building, of making him feel like he was helping family. Ryan had framed it as something temporary, something harmless, just a small financial move that Caleb wouldn't even have to think about. He had used the same tactics he had always used: charm, reassurance, half-truths. And Caleb, desperate to believe in something, desperate to hold on to the idea of family, had signed. Now the debt was real, and Ryan was gone. The full weight of it settled over me like a lead blanket. I had spent so long trying to erase Ryan from my life, trying to pretend that his destruction couldn't touch me anymore. But he had found a way back in, not through me, but through Caleb. And Caleb, my son in every way except blood, was the one who would suffer for it. Lauren's voice was quieter when she told me that Caleb had stopped answering her calls. He was shutting down the way people do when they realize they've been used. I knew that feeling too well. The shame, the anger, the crushing weight of realizing that someone you trusted had seen you as nothing more than a resource. It was the same feeling I had carried for years. And now Caleb was carrying it too. Lauren hesitated before telling me the last part. Ryan wasn't planning to stay. He never stayed. He had drained Caleb, used him for what he needed, and now he was looking for his next move. She had heard whispers from people they both knew. He was planning to disappear, to leave the city, maybe even the country. He had always been good at slipping away when things got bad. And once he was gone, Caleb would be left to deal with the wreckage. And that was why she had come to me. Because she knew that if anyone could stop Ryan, it was me. I should have walked away. I should have told her that this wasn't my problem, that Caleb wasn't mine, that I owed them nothing. I had spent years convincing myself of that, years trying to let go of the pain, the betrayal. But no matter how much I told myself Caleb wasn't my responsibility, the truth was, I still loved him. He had been my son for years. I had raised him, cared for him, sacrificed for him. And now he was in trouble, and I wasn't going to let Ryan take him down with him. There was no hesitation when I asked her where Ryan was staying. She told me, relief flickering across her face. But I wasn't doing this for her. I wasn't doing it for revenge, or for closure, or for some desperate attempt to fix the past. I was doing it because Caleb was about to learn the same lesson I had spent my entire life learning. That family isn't about blood. It's about who stands by you when the worst happens. And I refused to let Ryan be the only lesson he learned. Ryan had spent his entire life escaping consequences. No matter how much destruction he left in his wake, he always managed to land on his feet. He had a way of slipping through cracks, twisting reality, bending people to his will just enough to survive. Every time I thought he had finally hit rock bottom, he found a new way to pull himself up, always at someone else's expense. I had seen it with our parents, with me, with Lauren, and now he had done it to Caleb. But not this time. This time, he had nowhere left to run. Lauren had given me an address, a rundown motel on the outskirts of the city. The kind of place where people ended up when they had nothing left. The kind of place Ryan had never imagined himself in. He had always thought he was better than everyone else, always believed he would rise above, no matter how many people he had to step on to do it. But now, the truth had caught up with him, and he had no one left to manipulate. I drove there without hesitation. I had spent years pretending Ryan no longer existed, convincing myself that whatever happened to him wasn't my concern. But the moment I found out what he had done to Caleb, the moment I realized he had dragged the one person I still cared about into a spiral, something in me snapped. I wasn't going to let Caleb be another casualty. The neon sign of the motel flickered weakly, casting an eerie glow over the cracked pavement of the parking lot. The place looked half abandoned, a graveyard of forgotten people, each room holding someone trying to outrun their past. It was fitting. Ryan had spent his life running. But now, there was nowhere left for him to go. I stepped out of the car, my footsteps echoing in the quiet night. The air was thick with the stale scent of cigarette smoke and damp wood. I walked past the front desk without stopping. I didn't need to ask which room was his. I already knew. His door was slightly ajar. Typical Ryan. Careless, arrogant even now, still believing nothing could truly touch him. Still believing that, somehow, things would work out in his favor. I pushed the door open without knocking. The stench at me first, stale alcohol, sweat, and the lingering scent of something rotten. The room was a mess, clothes tossed haphazardly over the chair, empty beer bottles on the nightstand, fast food wrappers crumpled near the overflowing trash can. The air felt heavy, stagnant, as if time itself had stopped in this tiny, suffocating space. And there, in the middle of it all, Ryan sat slumped in a chair. His head was down, his elbows resting on his knees, a cigarette burning between his fingers. He didn't look up right away. For a brief second, I wondered if he even realized I was there. If he had finally reached the point where he just gave up. Then slowly he lifted his head. For the first time in my life, Ryan looked small. His skin was pale, his cheekbones sharp against his hollowed-out face. His once sharp, confident eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with exhaustion. He had lost weight, too much weight. His clothes, once tailored and sharp, now hung off him like they belonged to someone else. And for the first time, I saw something I had never seen in him before. Fear. Not of me. Not really. But of the fact that, for once, his usual tactics weren't going to work. He had nothing left to manipulate, no more leverage, no more lies to spin. He was trapped, and he knew it. I stepped forward slow, deliberate. I saw the way his shoulders tensed, the way his fingers twitched slightly against his cigarette. He was waiting for me to speak first. I didn't. I wanted him to sit in this moment, to feel the weight of it. I wanted him to realize that, this time, there was no way out. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, cracked with something that almost sounded like shame. Almost. But I wasn't here for apologies. I wasn't here for explanations. I had spent my entire life listening to Ryan talk his way out of things, and I wasn't going to give him the chance to do it again. I told him what was going to happen. He was going to fix this. He was going to return every cent he had stolen from Caleb, or I would make sure there was nothing left of him. There was no threat in my voice. None. Just cold, quiet certainty. For the first time in his life, Ryan didn't argue. He didn't try to spin it, didn't try to shift the blame. He just sat there, silent, like a man who had finally run out of ways to talk his way out of hell. But then, something I hadn't expected. Ryan had already tried to run. Lauren had been right. He had planned to disappear, to vanish before anyone could make him answer for what he had done. But something had gone wrong. The people he had borrowed money from weren't the kind of people who let debts go unpaid. He owed more than what he had taken from Caleb. A lot more. And now, they were looking for him. I saw the raw panic in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. Ryan had always been good at pretending he was untouchable. But now, for the first time, he was the one being hunted. I took a slow breath, letting the silence stretch between us. I had spent years hating this man, years wishing for the day he would finally suffer, finally understand what he had put me through. And now, that day was here, and I felt nothing for him. Ryan had always believed he was untouchable, that he could take, and the world would never make him pay for it. But the world had finally caught up with him, and this time, I wasn't going to save him. I turned to leave. Ryan didn't stop me. There were no last words, no final pleas. He knew there was nothing left to say. The next morning, I met with Caleb. He was different than I remembered. Older, harder. There was something in his eyes I recognized, something I had seen in my own reflection too many times before. He had learned the truth about Ryan the same way I had, through pain, but there was still time to stop him from making the same mistakes. I told him everything, and for the first time, I saw him let go. Ryan had spent his life making people believe they owed him something. He had used love like a weapon, twisting it, warping it, making people believe that family was a debt they could never repay. But Caleb wasn't falling for it anymore. And neither was I. Ryan was gone. Not dead. Not locked away. Just gone. And for the first time in my life, I didn't care where he was. I had spent years wondering what it would take to make him disappear from my life for good. But when it finally happened, there was no moment of satisfaction, no grand sense of justice. Just silence. The kind of silence that comes when something rotted has finally been cut away. The kind that lets you breathe again without realizing you had been suffocating for years. I never found out exactly what happened to him after I left that motel. No one called, no messages came through. The distant relatives who had once been his occasional defenders, the ones who had told me to be the bigger person, who had insisted that family forgives, had nothing left to say. Maybe he left town. Maybe he found some new sucker to latch onto. Maybe the people he owed money to finally caught up with him. But I never asked, and no one ever volunteered the information. Ryan had spent his life believing he was untouchable, that he could take and take and take without ever paying the price. But this time, there was no one left to bail him out. And that was the real punishment. For someone like him, someone who fed off of people, off of attention, off of control, being abandoned, being irrelevant, was worse than anything I could have done to him. For the first time in my life, I felt free. No more waiting for the next betrayal. No more bracing for impact. The weight I had been carrying for decades had been lifted, and I could finally see just how much space it had taken up inside me. But that didn't mean the damage Ryan had done was undone. Because while I might have walked away from him, there was still someone left standing in the wreckage he had created. Caleb. Lauren had been right. He was different now. The boy I had once raised, the boy I had carried on my shoulders and taught how to ride a bike, the boy I had stayed up with during fevers and helped with school projects had disappeared. In his place was someone older, harder, someone who had learned the same brutal lesson I had learned long ago. That sometimes the people you trust the most are the ones who hurt you worst. The last time I had seen him, before all of this, there had still been something soft in his eyes, some lingering belief that things could be fixed. But Ryan had taken that from him, just like he had taken everything from me once. And I knew exactly what that kind of betrayal did to a person. I didn't want Caleb to end up like me. I didn't want him to carry this anger, this weight, for years the way I had. I didn't want him to spend his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the next knife in the back. But I also knew I couldn't force him to let it go. I had spent years resenting people who had told me to move on before I was ready, who had acted like pain could be ignored, like betrayal was something you could simply walk away from. It wasn't. The only way to heal was to face it, to acknowledge it, and then, on your own terms, to decide what came next. So I called him. We met at a small diner, one of those places that hadn't changed in decades, with cracked red leather booths and a jukebox in the corner that played nothing but old country songs. The air smelled like coffee and bacon grease, and for a brief moment, it reminded me of the life I used to have, the life before Ryan had shattered it. Caleb was already there when I arrived, sitting at a booth in the back, staring down at his untouched plate of food, his fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of coffee. I sat down across from him, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. He looked exhausted, not just physically, but in the way a person looks when they've lost something they can't get back. His shoulders were tense, his jaw clenched, his eyes hollowed out with something deeper than just lack of sleep. And in that moment, I saw myself in him. I saw the way I had looked in the mirror for years after Ryan had taken everything from me. The shame, the anger, the quiet, crushing weight of wondering how you let yourself be fooled. Then finally he started talking. He told me everything. How Ryan had made him believe things would be different. That he had changed, that this time family actually meant something. How he had trusted him, not because he was stupid, but because he wanted to believe in something. Because he wanted to believe that blood still counted for something, that not all relationships had to be transactional. He told me how it had felt when he realized the truth, when he understood that Ryan had never seen him as anything other than a tool, another resource to drain before moving on. And worst of all, how he hated himself more than he hated Ryan, because he should have known better. I listened. I let him say everything he needed to say. And when he was done, I told him the truth. I told him that Ryan had spent his entire life making people feel like fools. That it wasn't his fault for wanting to believe in family, because that's what family is supposed to be. that it wasn't weak to want to trust someone, that it wasn't stupid to believe in people. But most of all, I told him that he wasn't alone, that no matter what had happened, no matter how much time had passed, I was still here, and I wasn't going anywhere. There was no dramatic moment, no sudden embrace, no cinematic resolution, just a long silence, followed by a small, almost imperceptible nod. And that was enough, because I knew, in that moment, that Caleb wasn't going to let this destroy him. He wasn't going to let Ryan define him the way Ryan had defined me for so many years. He was going to be okay, and so was I. I don't think about Ryan much anymore. Sometimes I wonder where he is, if he's still running, if he's still playing the same games, still making the same mistakes. But then I remember that it doesn't matter. He's not my responsibility. He's not my burden to carry. He's not my problem anymore. For the first time in my life, I finally understand what real freedom feels like. And this time it's mine.